We will fight till the end at sea, in the air. We will continue fighting for our land, whatever the cost. We will fight in the forests, in the fields, on the shores, in the streets.
The Ukrainian president invokes Churchill and Shakespeare in the first address by a foreign leader to the House of Commons. The UK, the EU and the US are united in turning off the Russian energy tap, targeting the main artery of the Russian economy.
Defending freedom is going to cost. It's going to cost us as well.
How might Putin react, and what will the decision do to energy prices? We'll have full analysis.
Here in Ukraine, there's a growing humanitarian crisis, with 2 million people fleeing the country and cities remaining under bombardment. I'll be speaking to a frontline children's doctor saving lives in the capital.
Also tonight, he was the man who was meant to ensure good behaviour in Parliament. But 4 years after a Newsnight investigation identified John Bercow as a bully, the former Speaker is banned from the Commons. We'll be speaking to one of the complainants, the former Black Rod, Lieutenant General David Leakey. Good evening. It's been a momentous day, a day full of huge economic significance in the fight against Putin, a speech that's made political history, and all the while the refugee numbers rise inexorably, passing the 2 million mark as people try to escape while suffering relentless shelling. And a day when we learned that an 11-year-old boy travelled 650 miles alone from Ukraine to the safety of relatives in Slovakia. The House of Commons was packed to hear Volodymyr Zelensky make history. At 5 o'clock this evening, he addressed the MPs by video link, welcoming sanctions, but repeating his appeal for a no-fly zone. But undoubtedly, one of the most significant developments today, designed to ratchet up the pressure on Putin, economic and psychological, was the concerted action over Russian energy, with announcements from America, Europe and the UK that Russian oil, gas and coal will be choked off. Immediately in the case of the US, over the course of the year is the UK plan, and the EU will cut its dependency on Russian gas by 2/3 this year. Well, we'll go to Yalda and Lviv a little while later to get the latest on the ground. But first, here's our economics editor Ben Chu on the impact of the energy sanctions on the way we will live too, and the fraught question of who makes up the shortfall in energy and at what cost.
The tide has turned. No more Russian oil shipments to the United States of America.
Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine.
This is a bold call for President Biden in a midterm election year. Indeed, it was a move the White House argued 2 weeks ago would hurt the US more than Russia. This boycott will send up the global price of crude oil further, hitting Americans in the pocket when they pay for petrol. Yet the really big economic and geopolitical question is whether Europe will follow America's lead. America only takes 1.5% of Russia's oil exports. Their biggest customer by far is Europe. They take half. The UK government has committed to do the same as the US, but all eyes are on EU leaders such as Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, seen here at the G7. Russia supplies 30% of Germany's oil.
I think it's much harder for Europe to act in this way. It's much more dependent on Russian oil. There aren't any easy or immediate solutions to replace those Russian supplies without a massive impact on the consumers and the European economy. So I think European policymakers and leaders, when they meet at the end of this week, are going to be trying to find out just how far can we go, how close can we get to commitments to phase out or reduce our dependence without forcing the lights off at home.
But what if they did follow? Major oil producers have been sanctioned by the West in the past, the likes of Iran, Iraq and Venezuela, but none on the scale of Russia. It pumps around 11 million barrels a day, around a tenth of global production. If you take even half of that volume out of global circulation, it will have a huge impact on global energy prices. This is why America is pressuring allies such as Saudi Arabia to pump more, and even seeking to get more production from formerly unfriendly states such as Iran and Venezuela. The other big question is, how will Russia respond to the US boycott? The country's Deputy Prime Minister, Alexander Novak, threatened last night that his country could shut off Russian gas exports to the EU in retaliation. The EU unveiled a plan today to reduce Russian gas imports by 2/3 by the end of this year, but they're not ready to go cold turkey straight away, despite the urgings of some. To understand why, let's remind ourselves just how reliant on Russian gas Europe is. Russia supplies 40% of Europe's gas at the moment. The UK's gas imports from Russia are estimated to be small, less than 5% of the total. But in Germany and Italy it's around 50%, and virtually all of the gas consumed in states like Finland and Latvia is Russian. This is a crisis where what seemed unlikely, even inconceivable one day, becomes reality the next. It's now not impossible to imagine a full halt to Russian energy exports to the West. The economic implications of that? They're sobering. Is there a ceiling on how high these energy prices could go?
Technically, no, because there is no swing spare capacity coming in. There's no tap or switch that can be turned on instantly from the supply side of view. And from demand, it has to reach levels where it starts to get painful for the average user. But there could be a long period of high prices, which would be very painful for consumers around the world.
People talk about the 1970s. Is that the best historical analogy that we have?
I think there are certainly parallels where you had the Arab oil embargoes and you did have huge spikes in prices, big slowdowns in the economy. But I would say the only thing is that was primarily just on oil. Here we're talking, certainly for continental Europe, about gas, about natural gas, about coal, and about crude oil. And I think that combination, there isn't really historical precedent for if we were to lose or cut off supply of all of them.
So, an unprecedented energy crunch could be around the corner, and perhaps a freezing up of the global economy.
Ben Chu joining us with it. We have the former Deputy Assistant to President Obama for Energy and Climate Change, Heather Zeichel, and former Cabinet Minister Robert Jenrick. Good evening to both of you. Robert Jenrick, first of all, does the government have to level with the public just about how bad this is going to be? After all, we were just saying, it's sanctions before, but none to the extent we're having with Russia.
Yes, I think it does, and you're starting to see that. As you heard in that report, we could be looking at an energy crisis unrivaled since the 1970s. And the forecast that we saw today suggests that household incomes could fall by a larger percentage this year than at any time since records began in 1955.
So what Rishi Sunak gave last time, around £350, and now we've had a tripling of energy costs already, would suggest that you think the Chancellor might or might not be a bit more generous this time round?
Well, I think he may need to do something. It depends on the scale of the challenge, but it looks as if this is going to be the most difficult economic year that we've seen in my lifetime.
A recession?
It could be. It could be. If you see the kind of inflation that's been predicted, potentially peaking at 8, 9 or 10%, and you're seeing this pressure on energy bills, not just for households, but also for energy-intensive industries and businesses, it's going to be very difficult. It also, I think, means that we need a more pragmatic energy policy where we balance all of our concerns, obviously net zero, which I'm personally very committed to, but also people's household incomes and energy security in a far more nuanced way than I think we've seen in recent years.
And just quickly on that whole point about companies going to need to have a bit of a bailout, aren't they? Because there's a fertiliser company had to be rescued. So there's going to have to be rescues of companies because of energy security.
Well, some might need that, yes.
So let me turn to you, Heather Zeichel, first of all. Joe Biden said this was no time for profiteering or price gouging, but actually, what can the administration do to stop that if it happens?
Well, I think what you heard from President Biden today was first and foremost that he recognized that this is not without cost. And for that reason, he made it very clear he's taking aggressive action, not only to start by releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but also engaging in those communications with other countries about how we make up for that crude that would otherwise be coming from Russia.
In a minute, your picture's frozen, I'm afraid, but in a moment I'm going to come back to you. But I put a question to Robert Jenrick that I'm also going to put to you. You know, the sacrifice of war and all that, but also the idea of who makes up the shortfall, you know, the moral imperative of all this. You know, we're going to do business with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela. You know, that would not be, these would not be actions of choice, would they?
No, absolutely not. And there's only really two countries in the world today that have sufficient capacity to make a difference, and that is Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. The Prime Minister and President Biden are and should be on the phone to those countries, getting them to increase capacity. I personally would be very concerned about us doing a deal with the Ayatollah in Iran or with Maduro in Venezuela. Those two malign regimes, you know, have a lot in common with President Putin. So relying on them to get us out of this situation is very worrying.
So tell me what you make of that, Heather. Is President Biden going to have to bite on leather and just take oil and gas from these regimes? Heather, can you hear me?
No, sorry, I apologize. Look, at the end of the day, the only way to stop oil from being, or fossil fuels for that matter, from being used as an economic weapon is to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And I think you heard very clearly from the president today, that's exactly what he intends to do. The goals to decarbonize the economy, to diversify by investing in electrification of vehicles, by doubling down on wind and solar. Those are the kinds of products that cannot be weaponized against the United States and countries across the world. But time is of the essence because, you know, the UK is going to cut off the Russian supply by the end of the year. In Europe, it's going to be 70%. But America, having been very recalcitrant of this last week, is actually going full pelt on this. And you don't have sufficient renewables. You don't have sufficient investment to yield quick returns. Well, I guess I'd argue the United States, from an energy portfolio perspective, is very well situated. We are one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the country. We continue to grow our domestic renewables portfolio year over year. In fact, we are now powering 52 million homes and businesses in America with clean energy. At the same time, there is broad recognition that it has to be this transition. And in the near term, there are some very compelling and important policy issues that need to be addressed. And I think that's exactly what the president intends to do. Robert Jenrick, I mean, you were saying that you're one of the people that are very passionate about net zero for 2050, but might there need to be a delay?
Well, I think you need a much more nuanced policy. We've had a very, I'm not sure if a delay is the right way of phrasing it, but you've now clearly got to wake up and balance net zero with other competing demands, energy security, and the pounds in the pockets of people in this country. And that, to me, means, of course, continuing to go hell for leather for renewables, which is, as you just heard, ultimately the way out of this and guaranteeing our security, but also maximising recovery of oil and gas in the North Sea, potentially reopen. Yeah, I personally was always a supporter of fracking. I don't think it's a quick fix, but I think we should be revisiting that question. But are we in any position to start mass producing heat pumps? Because that, in fact, would really help. Mass producing heat pumps and finding people that are actually able to put them in. There's not going to be a quick fix to be found in any of these things. And that's why, to go back to your original question, the government has to level with the public that if we're going down this route, and I think it's important that we do stand up to Putin, this is going to be the most difficult year, I think, for household incomes in my lifetime. And in fact, that was the very point I was going to put to Heather, because I don't think you heard Robert say that earlier. Do you think this is going to be the worst economic year in your lifetime for households in America? I think there's no question that it's going to be a challenge, but I also think that, you know, challenges bring new opportunity. And the fact that we are talking about, I guess I am constantly reminded of Albert Einstein's quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different solution. We've talked about the fact that we've seen this play before. We've seen this challenge in the 70s. We're probably going to see it again unless we make strategic decisions to stop allowing fossil fuels to be the economic weapon that it can be. Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. And we're joined now by our political editor, Nick Watt. Nick Watt, a couple of things tonight. First, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, made an announcement about Russian flights over
British airspace.
That's right. So that's an interesting development in the last few hours by Grant Shapps, a tweet from him. And I think we can take a look at that tweet in which Grant Shapps says that I have made it a criminal offence for any Russian aircraft to enter UK airspace, and now Her Majesty's government can detain these jets. We will suffocate Putin's cronies' abilities to continue living as normal while thousands of innocent people die. Right, now what is this not about? It's not about detaining scheduled Russian airlines because they're not flying here. It's not about detaining Russian private jets, those with RU on, they're not flying here. It's the grey area of private jets that are registered in a third country but are used by Russian oligarchs. And the legislation now is very, very tough. It says those aircraft can't come into the UK if they're used by any person connected with Russia. And I was talking to sources and they were saying that this involves detective work. It's not about sort of looking at a radar and seeing here's a Russian aircraft. It's a plane landing and then you have big questions about that plane. Interestingly, there's a plane at Farnborough Airport at the moment that is being looked at with great care. It is believed it's used by a Russian oligarch, but it's detective work to find that out.
And still on air travel of a different kind, there's the story over the last 3 days was, first of all, raised by Antony Blinken at a press conference, where Antony Blinken, the US Secretary, said that the Polish are going to give the Ukrainians MiG fighter jets because Ukrainians can fly those. They'll give them their fighter jets, and then America will backfill with American jets for the Polish Air Force. But it's all becoming too complex now, isn't it?
Yes, so tonight Warsaw has said that it is willing to send its MiG-29 jets to the Ramstein Air Base, that's the US air base in Germany, and it would put them at the disposal of the US. They would then request that the US would then hand over aircraft of similar capabilities. What is not said is that those MiG-29s would then obviously be for the use of the Ukrainian Air Force, who can only use those Soviet-designed aircraft. Interestingly, the Polish Prime Minister tonight, speaking in Oslo, has been saying this has got to be part of an agreed NATO operation. In Washington, the number 3 at the State Department are saying, well, this announcement came from Warsaw. They didn't tell us about it. But as you say, Antony Blinken has been talking about it. But look, this is all part of a very, very delicate dance. No one single country wants to be handing those aircraft over to Ukraine. That would leave them very exposed with Russia. It has to be an agreed NATO position, but it can't be a NATO operation. It's got to be enabling the Ukrainian Air Force.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, in a few moments, we'll hear from a former Black Rod after John Bercow was banned from the Commons. But first, over to Yalda, who has the latest from Ukraine. Yalda.
Kirsty, thank you. And Kirsty, this is a nation in turmoil as it approaches 2 weeks of this war. And in that 2 weeks, 2 million people have fled the fighting. That's 2 million in 13 days. The majority of the people have been women and children. And that number is set to rise, as is the civilian casualties, as bombardments over Ukrainian cities and towns continues. Just to give you a sense of how bad the situation is, in the port city of Mariupol, it's believed that a child died of dehydration. Now, in a moment, we'll be speaking to the deputy head of the Ukrainian president's office, Ihor Zhovka. But first, let's just get a sense of life for many of the refugees who have fled. Let's get this report from Louis Goodall, who joins us from the Polish-Ukrainian border.
All throughout Europe, all through the day, all through the night, journeys of mercy are being made. This German group of paramedics from Frankfurt are making the 1,250-mile journey to the Polish border to use their ambulance bus to help provide medical care to Ukraine's refugees.
We call it in Germany Ambulanzbus. So there's a big bus who can you can take 6 people on the beds here, and you can take medical care of them. It's like an emergency room on rolls.
But the Germans aren't the only Samaritans on the road to Medica. Indeed, the approach is full of people arriving with aid.
Їхати в Краків, Варшаву, Гданськ, Німеччина, Італія. Формується черга з тієї сторони. Будь ласка, ставайте в чергу наперед.
This crossing and everything that goes with it has ballooned even in the week since we first came here. This has become a village, albeit with no permanent inhabitants. Just those on their way through, trying to work out what comes next. A process even set to music. Surreally, almost no item can't be found donated or abandoned at this weird frontier. Such is the demand on transport, the police have asked if the paramedics could drive families to Przemyśl, the next town.
На морозі 2 поїзда проїхали, нас не взяли, ми такі маленькими дітками стояли, чекали поїзд.
Не відкривали двері поїзда.
The baby's name is Lev. It means lion, which could hardly be more appropriate. All the children of this country are being forced to summon a courage beyond their years. What's your name?
Lesia, Victoria, and my brother Andrei.
Andrei. Hi, Andrei. My name's Lewis. Where have you come from in Ukraine?
Kharkiv.
From Kharkiv?
Yes.
So very bad fighting in Kharkiv?
Yeah, very bad.
How long have you been travelling? How many days?
2 days.
2 days?
Yes. Very cold.
This will be the end of the journey for few. Most, including little Lev, will have much further to go. And more courage to show. The morning train from Rzeszów on the border to Krakow, 2 hours to the west. It is yet more time spent, more energy expended. But as desperate as it feels on here, and it does, you're never far from something to lift the spirits, a bit of heart to punctuate the pull. Volunteers at each stop handing over food and water at every carriage door. Look at that. It's needed, all this supplies. That was full of bread 30 seconds ago. It's now completely empty. Just look at this. Just look at this. Imagine New Street Station or Euston Station or King's Cross Station, Manchester Piccadilly Station like this. That is the scale of what this country is facing. So where are you going now? You're from Kharkiv. Where are you going now?
We go to Germany.
When you think of Vladimir Putin, what do you think?
Пошел нахуй, Путин. Пошел ты нахуй.
Putin, terrorist number 1.
Yes.
Terrorist number 1. And how old are you?
I'm 17.
You're 17.
Yes. I study in high school and so я навіть не встигла закінчити школу. Насправді в мене було дуже класне життя і ці ситуації дуже змінили моє життя. Я досі не можу зрозуміти, що це сталося саме з Україною.
Many here don't know where they're going. But some are luckier. 1.2 million have entered Poland. And yet there are no refugee camps. And that's because of people like Kasia and Marcin.
Nice to meet you, Lewis. How are you doing? You all right?
Poles who have taken in entire Ukrainian families to their homes. A family of 4 has become 7.
And to be clear, you don't know Oksana?
Not at all.
You never met her before?
Never.
She came to stay with you, which was, when did she arrive?
Last Wednesday. Ash Wednesday.
Do you know others who have done it?
Yes. Actually, we are surrounded by people who did that. Our cousin who lives next door, yesterday, he took a family of 3 as well.
Do you have any idea how long this arrangement will last? I mean,
no one does.
No one does, and yeah.
So it's open-ended?
Well, that's what I told her when I picked her up at the train station. I said, okay, you can stay with us as long as you need to.
It isn't just the family thinking about the long term. The Polish authorities are seeking to integrate refugees at such speed that in less than a week, Oksana's kids have already been enrolled in a local school.
Як мені в польській родині, я дуже вдячна, дуже мені добре здесь і моїм дітям. І я вважаю, що мені просто дуже пощастило, що я потрапила в цю родину. І що ще сказати, не знаю. Правда, дуже пощастило. Я цих людей я не забуду ніколи в житті. І мої діти теж будуть пам'ятати, що вони зробили для нас, для чужих людей.
In Poland, we remember the Second World War, yeah, and for example, my grandfather, he was a soldier, and I believe that he survived because at some point some stranger helped him as well.
This war, like that war, is hell. But now, as then, in hell's embers, everywhere you look, there is light, the best and worst of us. The uncomfortable thing, when you really sit and think about it, is that one has to flow from the other. Humanity, in all its shades.
Louis Goodall reporting there from the Polish-Ukrainian border. Well, earlier I spoke to Ihor Zhovka. He's a spokesperson for the office of the President of Ukraine. I asked him about the humanitarian corridors and the latest.
Today in the morning, we had a very cautious optimism on the corridor from Mariupol, and from Mariupol to Zaporizhia, we managed to have this corridor functioning. I cannot tell you the situation up to date because for the time being, this rescue operation have to be finalized. The same was optimism about the corridor in Sumy, where we should evacuate not only Ukrainians, but some foreign citizens, including foreign students from some countries who are wanting to leave this occupied territory. But well, today, after yesterday's third round of negotiations, when we again raised this issue with the Russian side, today there has to be some result expected.
One of the conditions that Russia has laid out is a call for Ukraine's neutrality. They've said they want Ukraine to put in its constitution that it will not ever join NATO. Is this something that Ukraine would now consider to stop the bombs, to stop the fighting?
We are ready to discuss this issue with the Russian Federation. At the same time, we have to make strong security conditions for Ukraine. If Ukraine would choose an option to become a neutral state, to become a state which is not for the time being desiring to enter NATO. And that's why my president is speaking today about wider document about possible security guarantees for Ukraine if it obtains the neutral status. So it should not be the security guarantees only from the neighboring states, including Russia, by the way, but from some other big states like the US, Great Britain, Turkey.
This evening, we're hearing about the banning of oil and gas by the United States of Russian oil and gas, as well as the UK saying that they're going to phase out oil. Do you feel that's sufficient?
Not really, but we're thankful to the recent sanctions US and UK had introduced. The same we demand from the European Union. We want them to repeat the same sanctions as far as the Russian commodities are concerned. So strict embargo on Russian commodities, be it oil, gas or other commodities to the territory of the European Union. We should think about other economic sanctions like closing the ports everywhere in the world for the Russian vessels. We should be talking about some enlarging personal sanctions. We should be talking about visa depriving for not only Russian elite. So the spectrum is still, wide. The sanctions are not enough, but do not listen to those who say sanctions do not matter. They already matter. We need as strong sanctions as possible immediately.
And is Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky still pushing with NATO members to impose a no-fly zone? Because, of course, we've heard NATO say that's off the table.
My president is pushing this issue every day and every hour, as well as the leadership of Ukraine, talking to our partners and friends and to the North Atlantic NATO institution. We say that if NATO is not ready to introduce a no-fly zone, let's help Ukraine with increasing its air capacities. I mean air defense, I mean fighter jets. This is a matter of life and death.
That was Ihor Zhovka, the deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, speaking to me a little earlier. Well, joining me now from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, is Dr. Anastasia Bazilovich, a pediatrician. Thank you very much, Dr. Bazilovich, for joining us here on the program. You're really on the front line now of this war. You're saving lives. You're there in the hospital day and night with the patients. Just give us a sense of what's happening there.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for giving me the possibility to speak. First, I want you to translate from medical word to English. What does it mean, dehydration? Yes, the child died. The child died in the center of Europe because lack of water. So the child that died in Mariupol, she was in the shelter, and the shelter was destroyed, and she was staying without water and feeding for 3 days. So after this, when she was rescued, she was dehydrated, so the lack of water was so high that it wasn't possible to save her. And the only treatment that she needed, in fact, was infusion, and there was no possibility to bring her to the hospital. The other child should be amputated one hand because after the shooting her, the Russian army didn't permit to bring her to the hospital, and when she received her help, her arm wasn't possible to save. So our children are dying. On today, it's 55 children already died because of Russian army. One other child who is staying in Hostomel now, and you know that near the city, near the Kiev, now we have very hot points, and Hostomel is one of the hottest. So in the yard of that child, the Russian tank staying, and that child with difficult invalidity should be staying out without water and without possibility to be in a warm place or eat something, and without any hope on some corridor. We absolutely needed this humanitarian corridor, but all the things that was before, when they are trying to save our children, they were starting shooting. So that's the tragedy.
It's a devastating situation. You've also said that many of the children are being brought there with bullet wounds.
And the second level of our tragedy is that it's the children which are staying in shelters, which are staying in Ukraine, which are not in emigration. They are in closed things, and the epidemic would start. We already have some flashes of acute infections. We already have flashes of acute respiratory infections, simple like chickenpox and flu, but that's important when children are closed in one rooms. We have some intestinal infections and so on. I am even not speaking about psychological problems and post-traumatic syndrome, which have each child in Ukraine now. And it doesn't matter if he's staying under the bombs into the shelter or just going into the evacuation. So all the medics are staying on their...
Doctor, I just wanted to ask you, I just wanted to ask you, when the air raid sirens go off, where do you take the children? How do you get underground into the bunkers?
It depends, in fact. Usually, parents with children going up, they go into their own flats and staying there. But I think that maybe 30% of families which are preferring to stay into the shelter for 24 hours per day. It's happening like this as well.
Yes, Doctor, it's a really difficult situation there and across this country for so many children. Anastasia Barzilovich, a paediatrician in Kiev, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. Well, Kirsty, as you can hear, devastating stories coming out of the capital and, frankly, in many parts of this country. We'll continue our coverage for Newsnight throughout the week here from Lviv. But back to you in the studio in London.
Thank you very much. In 2018, a Newsnight investigation revealed that 3 people who worked for John Bercow, the then Speaker of the House of Commons, had complained about repeated bullying and verbal abuse, something he strenuously denied at the time. Well, today, the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards vindicated the complainers after an early investigation was blocked by a small number of MPs. Catherine Stone found him to have acted as a serial liar and a serial bully. She said he displayed threatening conduct towards staff, including verbal abuse and displays of anger. We now know, too, that after John Bercow appealed her report, the independent expert panel held up all 21 findings. He's the first Speaker of the House of Commons in modern history to be blocked for a peerage and is now banned from holding a Commons pass. Bercow, a Conservative MP for 22 years, jumped ship to Labour last year, and now his membership of the Labour Party has been suspended. Here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
Order! Order!
chuntering from a sedentary position is not helpful.
A combative and controversial figure, often spoiling for a fight. A speaker who belittled critics in public, and behind closed doors, a bully.
It seemed to be over-the-top anger. I'm not sure he was completely in control.
Allegations first aired 4 years ago on Newsnight, which led to the core finding today by an independent expert panel, which concluded that John Bercow was a serial bully. Like many bullies, it added, he had those whom he favoured and those whom he made victims. The panel also found that in his evidence to various inquiries, the former Speaker was a serial liar. Today's report endorsed the separate conclusions of the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, who upheld 21 complaints against John Bercow by 3 members of his staff. Angus Sinclair, his first private secretary, Lord Lisvane, the most senior House of Commons official, and Kate Ems, the Speaker's second private secretary. Angus Sinclair spoke to Newsnight 4 years ago for the report, which prompted the inquiry.
Suddenly his mobile phone, which he'd been holding, was flung on the desk in front of me, and it broke into a lot of bits. And it was a pretty dramatic moment, and he left the office shortly afterwards.
John Bercow rejected today's findings, saying, "The case against me would have been thrown out by any court in the land, since it's based on the flimsiest of evidence and advanced by old-school dogmatists." And tonight, he was fighting to clear his name. John Bercow, any word for Newsnight about tonight's report, which does accuse you of serial bullying? Well, there we go. John Bercow off to do another interview, this time with LBC. He's been doing a lot of interviews today, but interestingly, not very keen to talk to Newsnight, which of course did air those original bullying allegations.
It was just unbelievable, yeah.
A former leader of the House of Commons, who found herself at the wrong end of John Bercow's temper, welcomed the report.
But if you look back at some of the kind of criticisms, banter, which if it was in a playground you would say was bullying, then you can clearly see in plain sight that there was bullying going on in the chamber. But actually for me it was outside the chamber. It was the way that he spoke to his staff, the senior clerks, particularly the junior clerks, and it was the way he would keep people waiting and shouting at them, and just some of the incidents that I saw and heard were completely unacceptable. And I used to find my own ways to kind of fight back in some small way.
A former Commons official who spoke up in the Newsnight report 4 years ago believes that Westminster has fostered bullies.
I'm afraid there's a wider cultural problem in Parliament, which is exacerbated by the power dynamic that exists between MPs and staff, between elected members and appointed staff. And I'm afraid that at the top of the tree, for the Speaker, who is the most powerful person in Parliament, that dynamic is just reinforced. So I think John Bercow's natural personality may have played part of this, but actually he was also operating in a very unhealthy atmosphere.
A defining moment for Westminster as it confronts uncomfortable allegations from its very recent past. The challenge now is to show the culture is changing.
Nick, well, I'm joined now by Lieutenant General David Leakey, the former Black Rod, who was a fourth complainant and a witness to one of the complaints. Good evening to you. I understand you bumped into John Bercow today. What happened?
He appeared to be very convivial, very bright and breezy to start with, and then said something pretty unpleasant to me, and he was quite clearly viscerally angry.
Can you tell me what he said?
No.
Simply because it was so awful?
Yes.
So tell me, he says, of course, that it's a kangaroo court. This is all about the fact that he was a reformer. What do you make of the clarity of this report today? Serial bully, serial liar.
Well, starting with John Bercow's rejection of the panel and its findings, this is typical of John Bercow. If he disagrees with a view, a point of view, or somebody's decision or recommendation, he will say so in spades, and usually in pretty severe language. And it demonstrates, and particularly if you look at his statement, the tone of his language, the language he uses, it is absolutely disrespectful. It's not disrespectful, it's insulting of some of those parts of the British establishment, which he despises, which we should respect. For example, a former appeal court judge.
In Nick Watt's report there, the words were used that really Westminster fosters bullies. And I wonder if there were a number of other people that just were complicit in it, just didn't do anything about it because it was easier not to.
Well, I think there were two groups of people. One was John Bercow. He has said that this was a kangaroo court. You've just made that point. John Bercow has no one to blame but himself for the fact that there was a kangaroo court. He had 11 years as the chairman of the commission in which to put in place a proper process, and he didn't. So he can't complain now about a kangaroo court. He had 11 years to put in place a process which had been recommended by internal reports, external advisors, and so on.
But just to, is this an atmosphere that fosters bullies? That's indeed what was in Nick Watt's report.
Yes, because in a way it is. MPs are elected, peers are appointed into Parliament and feel a sense of entitlement, which is to some extent completely justified. They are entitled to be heard and respected because they've been elected, and that's what they're there for. But as in any leadership post, you have to demonstrate some other human qualities, and one of those is a bit of humility and a bit of kindness, and Bercow didn't.
And Andrea Leadsom there claims that she was one of the ones that got the rough end of the stick.
Andrea Leadsom was one of the leaders of the House of Commons, I think for 2 years or more, and she presided over the leadership of the House of Commons, just as John Bercow was chair of the Commission of the House of Commons, and yet still a proper process was not implemented or put in under her tenure. The leadership, the political leadership in the House was lacking, in my view.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'll be back again tomorrow. Until then, from all of us here, good night.